Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of webcasts with key figures in the debate on the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. In the hot seats today are Michael Lowe and Ross Greer. You may notice they look younger than our usual guests, and that's because Michael is just 17. He's a pupil at Bishopbriggs Academy. He's currently sitting his hires and is a youth representative with Better Together, which is campaigning for a no vote in the independence referendum. Ross Greer is 18. He's convener of Young Scottish Greens, and he's currently working with Yes Scotland, campaigning for a yes vote in the referendum. Now, you, as normal, have been sending in your questions for our guests. Let's kick off with those then. First of all, a question from Tom Masters, who says, what do you think are the key issues for young people in the independence debate, and why have you decided to get involved in the campaign as a volunteer? Michael, first of all, you're 17 years old. What on earth are you doing getting involved in politics?
Well, I think that the real reason I'm involved in this campaign is because it's the biggest decision Scotland's going to take for 300 years. It's going to affect young people in particular, so I think it's particularly important for them to get involved because we're going to have to live with the outcome of this decision for longest, and I think that I'm really passionate that we make the case for young people and all of Scotland to have the best that they can, which I believe is in the UK, and that's why I'm working volunteering for Better Together.
Ross, what's your answer to Tom's question? Why have you decided to get involved in the campaign?
Well, I think, I believe that Scotland can be better. I think we can be a more prosperous and fairer country, and I think that this campaign on both sides is about what kind of country we actually want to be for future generations. I think it's really, really important that young people engage with that because we'll be living with the result one way or another for far longer than anyone else.
Amongst your friends, how interested are they in the independence campaign, or are you, and I don't mean to be rude, kind of just geeks?
I think interest among young people is growing. They're certainly aware of the debate. There's not an ignorance of what's happening, and I'm certainly finding more and more young people who do start talking about it, about what kind of country they want Scotland to be, about where they want a fairer and more prosperous Scotland. So I certainly think that there's greater engagement, particularly now that as of last week we know 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote. It seems real to young people now, so they're really enthusiastically engaging.
I think there really is huge involvement. The sort of 16 and 17-year-olds that I'm speaking to in school and my friends are actually really interested in it and really want to have the debate, get the facts about what this would mean for them. And I think that as much as Ross can claim that young people want a fairer Scotland than they have, a lot of young people actually that I'm hearing from my friends is that they think there's too many questions over independence, that it's not really the right path for us and it's not about getting the best for Scotland. And I think that's why a lot of young people, as polls have shown a lot, are saying that we should stay in the UK and keep the best of both worlds that way.
Angus Miller has been in touch from Edinburgh, and he says people under the age of 25 will not really remember a time before devolution. You two presumably wouldn't do. How could this affect young people's attitudes towards independence or the Union? How do you think your experience of growing up with a Scottish Parliament has shaped some of your political ideas?
I think it's actually been really important that we've got the best of both worlds there. We do have Scottish decisions made here in Scotland in our own Parliament over those devolved issues, but that we also have the strength of the UK, and I think that one of the important things in the referendum will be the difference between independence and devolution, that it's not the same thing and that devolution isn't a step towards independence but giving us that strength in the UK.
Do you want more powers for the Scottish Parliament?
I personally, as a 17-year-old, haven't looked at all the intricacies of sort of tax raising powers and things, but I think that...
Just, it's your gut feeling that you think that MSP should control more than they do at the moment?
I think that each individual issue has to be looked at by itself, and if it's for the benefit of Scotland. I think that one of the things we should also look at doing... Perhaps not. I think that one of the things that we should be looking at in terms of devolution is not just always focusing on the Scottish Parliament, but actually giving a bit more real power to local councils so that local government is helping people at that level as well.
Ross, opinion polls seem to suggest that the majority of Scots actually favour staying in the United Kingdom and having a strong Scottish Parliament within the United Kingdom. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think it's not that a majority of Scots disagree with our arguments for independence. I think 2 years ago I would have voted no, because no one had ever told me why to vote yes in a way that compelled me. And we're finding more and more that as people hear our arguments, our positive arguments for a fairer, more prosperous Scotland, they do come on board with the yes campaign. I was up in Shetland last week debating against Tavish Scott, and the swing in the debate was towards the yes vote. And we had young people coming up to us at the end and saying that they simply hadn't had the arguments explained to us at the end. And particularly you brought up welfare as an excellent example. The bedroom tax is devastating hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland. Only 4 Scottish MPs out of 59 voted for the bedroom tax, but it's being inflicted on Scotland. It's something that Scotland opposed and Westminster imposed, and we think with issues like that, it should be obvious. Westminster isn't working in Scotland's best interest, and we're capable of doing something better.
I mean, Ross, you claim that your support has gone up a lot, but that might be what you hear working in the Yes Scotland office all the time, but the thing that I hear a lot from young people is that they support the United Kingdom, and the polls haven't shown any huge increase in support. It's sort of wavered about the same, gone down a little bit, gone up a little bit, and I don't think there is that huge increase in support.
Ross, what turned you from a no to a yes?
I think I'm not a nationalist. That idea doesn't interest me. And to put it very, very simply, I think that democracy works much, much better in a country of about 6 million people than about 60 million. It's a slightly flippant answer, but I believe in localism. I believe that at that level you get something much more representative. We gave the example of the bedroom tax. That was something that a majority of Scottish MPs actively opposed, but they did not ultimately get a choice. I mean, we've seen time and time again, because Scotland has such a small number of representatives down at Westminster, it doesn't actually affect the result of general elections. I mean, between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, there are only 4% of representatives actually from Scotland. How can we truly believe that the Westminster system is acting in Scotland's best interest?
Is the Holyrood system any better when it comes to localism?
I think it's certainly done a lot in that way. Now, for me, I think we could go a lot further. I think that localism is something that doesn't just stop with independence, but I think independence is our best way of getting that. We've already seen some really exciting discussions about what would be in the written constitution of an independent Scotland, and hopefully in that we could enshrine rights like powerful local communities.
Here's a question from Fergus Henderson. Do you believe Westminster subsidises Scotland, or that Scotland pays its own way at the moment, Michael?
Well, I think the fact that the figure we always get from the Nationalists is the 9.6% one, but actually we put
9.6% of what?
They claim that we put in 9.6% of tax revenue and only get, I think it's 9.3% of spending back, but actually in real terms we do seem to get more from that figure. But I don't think it's quite just a debate about that. We have many strengths in the United Kingdom that aren't just the fact that we have a strong economy that we're in. We have the British pound, which is our currency, and the Nationalists are divided over that. The campaign that they are led by, some want to join the euro even, some want to stay in the pound and create a sterling zone that we're not sure we can guarantee, and some, the man that you work with, Dennis Kahneman, would propose we have a new currency, and I think that's your own view yourself, and I think that division doesn't really provide an answer, whereas the only way to guarantee we keep the Scottish pound, for example, the pound, for example, is for Scotland to stay in the United Kingdom.
That doesn't really quite answer the question, though, because the question was, do you think that Scotland is subsidised by Westminster or not? And I absolutely think that that's not the case. I mean, you brought up the figure yourself. It's actually been updated this year, so it's much closer to 9.9% of the total that we put into the UK. We still only get back out about 9.3%. And I think that shows that Scotland more than pays its way.
But that's not a real terms figure. When you're asked if it's a subsidy, then you've got to look at whether we do get more money out or we do not. If you're taking percentages of different figures, that's not going to give you the same amount of money.
No, but the UK is in debt. Now, what that actually means is that Scotland is proportionately in less debt than the rest of the United Kingdom. But surely that shows... Yes, absolutely, still in debt, like a huge number of other countries across the world. We've just came out of a global economic crisis. But that shows, without any doubt, that Scotland is in a better financial position than the UK as a whole. But you tried to flip it to currency. I thought I've directly answered the question that I don't believe Scotland's subsidised by Westminster. But currency in itself, that's a really important one as well. We saw in debates in the last couple of weeks, there seems to be an attitude that Scotland doesn't really have any right to pound sterling. Now, surely pound sterling at the moment is just as much Scotland's currency as it is any other part of the UK.
Because it's the United Kingdom's currency.
You personally didn't believe in maintaining the pound?
Personally, I would go with an independent Scottish currency, but what's really annoyed me about this debate so far is this feeling that Scotland almost has no right to continue to use pound sterling. Now, I would have, as I said, an independent Scottish currency. I think that's the right course of action. But I think pound sterling is perfectly viable. It's a fully tradable currency. Scotland
While
can
we're on
use
that
it.
subject, William in Edinburgh says jobs, savings, investments are utterly dependent on the strength of the UK sterling currency. He says all his hard work could be put in jeopardy by a Yes campaign that does not know what currency is going to be used in an independent Scotland. Andrew Walker also asks, can you give a guarantee that Scotland will retain the pound as its currency if it leaves the UK? Can you give that guarantee?
I think it's incredibly simple. On day one of independence, which is in 2016, not 2014, that's an important point in itself. Day one of independence, the current Scottish Government's position is that we will be using pound sterling. But the first thing that we do in an independent Scotland is we elect our own government. And that government can make decisions about what Scotland does for the next couple of decades and far longer. So yes, day one, it's pound sterling. I will continue to campaign for an independent Scottish currency.
Why do you want an independent Scottish currency? What's the big advantage of that?
I believe, this flows into my argument again about the democracy element, about localism. I think particularly the Eurozone project has shown that smaller currencies much more viable than these larger currencies. I don't think that there's anything disastrous that's going to happen with pound sterling, but I think an independent Scottish currency gives us our own kind of flexibility.
The pound is the oldest and most successful currency, but you just pulled me up for not answering the question straight.
Therefore, Michael, it makes sense for an independent Scotland to continue to use the pound.
Well, I think that it makes sense for a Scotland within the United Kingdom to keep using the pound, but the question you just asked Ross, and he did evade what she just pulled me up for, was can you guarantee that we can still use the pound? And you can't guarantee that we'll use another country's currency.
That's not how it works.
Even so, is it truly independence to cede control over that currency but still use it?
It's a fully tradable
What
currency.
control do MSPs have over the currency at the moment?
None. Surely you can agree with that. MSPs don't have any control. Scotland at the moment cannot control these serious economic levers. That's why we see 1 in 4 children in Scotland living in poverty. That's why the projection is
I asked Michael the question, Ross.
But it doesn't matter only that there's children in Scotland living in poverty. It's just as bad that there's children south of the border living in poverty, and to me that is just as important. And I don't want to throw up a border and say that we care about tackling poverty in Scotland. We need to tackle it across the United Kingdom. It's no more important. It's wrong in both places that there's poverty in Dunfermline.
Let's just stick with the currency if we can do. So, Michael, let's imagine, for instance, that there's a yes vote in 2014. What would you personally like to see an independent Scotland? What currency would you like them to have?
Well, if we are in that position, which is speaking as a hypothetical that I don't want to see, I would prefer the pound because I know it's a strength of the United Kingdom. It is a strong currency, and in fact, if you're even down to the fact that if you're going to put the whole country through the inconvenience of changing all their currency and learning a new one, there has to be a really compelling argument for it, and I don't think there is. I think there's a really compelling argument for keeping the pound, and the safest way of doing that is to stay in the United Kingdom.
Malcolm Osborne cites some figures showing child poverty projected to rise. He asks Michael to explain why anyone would want to continue this situation, which is currently in the UK.
To continue in the UK or continue a situation
Well, to continue a situation where child poverty is projected to increase.
Well, of course I don't want to continue a situation where child poverty is increasing, and I personally, as a member of the Labour Party, oppose a lot of the policies of Westminster, the Westminster government just now. But I don't think that the SNP are using, for example, enough levers that they have under devolution to tackle issues in Scotland, because their end game is independence and everything is about that to them, rather than using the powers they have to protect people from measures that are causing things such as this growing poverty.
Ross, Carmel Keenan writes to us saying that Alex Salmond often refers to Norway and Denmark as examples of small, successful, independent countries. She says she'd like to ask you, are you aware of how high taxes are in either of these countries?
Yes, I think there are certainly differences in the rate of tax, and these countries do have higher rates on a lot of taxes and lower rates on some. Largely it's higher. I don't have any serious objection to that. I think this idea of Alex Salmond referring to, I'm not a member of Alex Salmond's party, I have no reason to defend him, but I do think that Denmark's a really interesting example. It's very, very comparable to Scotland, very similar populations. While 1 in 4 children in Scotland live in poverty, 1 in 8 in Denmark do. They have half the rate of child poverty. And we have to think, what has Westminster done wrong that we have resulted in this situation. You said child poverty is set to rise. It's 50,000 more children in Scotland will live in poverty by 2020 under the current situation. Clearly Westminster isn't working for Scotland. I mean, we've already been through the arguments about the bedroom tax. Decisions being made at Westminster aren't being made in Scotland's interest.
But the argument that we will just eradicate child poverty by independence that Nicola Sturgeon made just doesn't offer any solution at all other than independence is the answer. It doesn't tell us how that's going to happen, and it's not a feasible proposition.
Well, Ross will tell us. How is that going to happen?
I think an interesting one for both of us, because we've campaigned on it together before, is the living wage. Now, independence doesn't guarantee anything, but staying in the union doesn't guarantee anything either. This isn't a vote that we're going to have on specific policies. It's a vote on the constitution, what kind of constitutional settlement we have. But if you look in Scotland, there's a broad consensus around making the minimum wage a living wage. It's something that we both agree on. It's something that Westminster has stopped from happening. If the Scottish Parliament had the power to create a living wage, it probably would.
Okay, so instead of the minimum wage, you prefer a living wage,
Yeah.
and you would somehow eradicate child poverty, or certainly attempt to half child
I think
poverty.
we can certainly do a lot to tackle
to
child
levels
poverty.
in Denmark. As we say, some of these countries have higher rates of taxation than we do here in the UK currently. How do we pay for some of the policies you would like an independent Scotland to implement? Because it sounds relatively expensive.
I think, yeah, I mean, there are some taxes obviously can go up, but there's a lot of things that we can do.
Which
as well.
taxes?
Well, I think, personally,
You're in a job now. You're only 18 years
Yeah.
old. You're getting paid a salary. How much of your salary would you like to give in taxation to pay for these extra services?
I'm still in a position where I don't have a huge amount of outgoings myself, so I could probably afford to pay a higher rate of tax.
But what do you think everybody should pay? Do you think?
Well, I think tax should be progressive. I mean, there shouldn't be one flat rate of tax. The more you earn, the higher proportion of it you should have to pay. I think that's something we both agree on, regardless of constitutional
Yeah, but you know
settlement.
roughly what the tax rate in the UK is at the moment. What do you think it ought to be? Presumably higher in order to pay for greater public services.
I think there's a totally different way of thinking about it rather than just changing the rates of the kind of tax we have at the moment. I think, for example, I think the land value tax is an excellent idea, actually as a replacement to council tax and business rates. I think land value tax would bring in just over an extra £1 billion a year in Scotland. That was something that the Green Party campaigned for, has campaigned for a number of years. But it's not just through tax that we can pay for these things. If you look at Norway, and Scotland discovered oil in the North Sea. They've had roughly the same kind of boom. Norway has a state-owned oil company. Now, I'm a Green and I have different issues with oil and gas, but Scotland and Norway have both harvested the resources in the North Sea. Why has Scotland got poorer whilst Norway built up a massive reserve of money from the profits it made through its state-owned oil company and has used those profits to create excellent public services and to tackle child poverty?
Michael, why do you disagree with that?
And making such a big deal of oil and its impact in Scotland does sort of worry people in terms of the economy, I think, because if you look at the fluctuation in oil prices, it's huge. Between the highest and lowest price of oil per year in the past 10 years, we've seen a difference of £11 billion. That's the budget of the NHS in Scotland. To have that sort of volatility in our economy isn't safe, isn't going to guarantee us great public services. And whilst the SNP, the government who've proposed we have this referendum and are encouraging us to vote a certain way in it, are proposing that we'll have low tax to the right people. They're promising to cut corporation tax, and then to others propose high services.
What's
it just
wrong with
doesn't
what
fit.
Ross is suggesting, though, which is actually to say people in work in independent Scotland should pay more in tax, and what they'll get are better public services and lower rates of, for instance, child poverty. Isn't that a good thing?
Well, not necessarily in every case, because actually one of the things that's really crippling a lot of families who are working hard and try to earn their way is a higher burden of personal tax. I think the Tories have made a big deal out of the fact that the Lib Dems have made a massive deal out of the fact that the personal allowance has gone up, but it's sort of slipped beneath the radar that the 40% bracket now includes 400,000 more people. That's something I personally oppose, and I hope that Labour would promise to put that up again. I think that the personal burden of taxation for a lot of families is already something that's hitting them really hard in a difficult time after a recession, and proposing that we have a Scotland with higher tax rates for all families isn't something that I want to see.
Higher tax rates for those that can afford to pay them. There are incredibly wealthy people who I think don't pay as much tax as they should. They have a duty to society. We're not talking about the poorest families having to pay more. Obviously not. We're talking about these incredibly wealthy people contributing a bit more to society. But as I said, it doesn't just need to be about tax. It can be about harnessing our natural resources for people. It doesn't need to be oil. It could be renewables as well.
On that subject, Tina Wilson asks, Ross, can you explain to me why the oil belongs to Scotland?
I think that because round about 95% of it is in what are agreed as Scottish territorial waters. There's an area that's disputed. It's a very small area. The overwhelming majority is in what are internationally regarded as Scottish territorial waters. But I think we can focus far too much on the oil and gas because there are other incredibly viable sectors in Scotland, like renewables. Scotland has a huge proportion of Europe's renewable potential. We can harness that. We can harness that through private investment and state-owned.
Are you comfortable, as somebody who supports a yes vote in Scottish independence, that the economy in its initial stages at least would be quite heavily dependent on oil and gas? I mean, you after all are a Scottish Green. Is that something that leaves you comfortable?
I think that we can do far, far more to invest in renewable technology as well. I think oil and gas, my issue with it isn't on a Scotland scale. My issue is with fossil fuels on a global scale. I don't think the damage they cause is worth it on a global scale. That's not an issue confined to Scotland. I think we could do far more in Scotland with the powers of independence to invest in renewable technology. We have, as I said, a quarter of Europe's renewable potential. That's hundreds of billions of pounds over the next couple of decades, as long as we invest correctly now. And Westminster's not doing that.
Michael, John O'Donnell says there are 40 years of oil left, at least. Why do unionists refuse to accept Scotland's oil as a valuable income for an independent Scotland?
Well, I think it is a valuable income, but it's a valuable income just now as well. And I don't think that I can try and put a figure on how long we've got left in terms of oil. But even so, it isn't infinite. And to put such focus on one sector of the economy just isn't really safe and wouldn't guarantee a strong Scottish economy. John Swinney's own report to the Scottish Cabinet that they didn't wish to share with the Scottish people said that we would be a lot more dependent on oil compared to what we are now. We have a strong economy with different sectors and from which tax is redistributed across the whole United Kingdom.
It made more sense in the boom years of the 1980s, which you would remember, when oil really raised an awful lot of cash for the UK Treasury. Wouldn't it have been more sensible for an independent Scotland to have used that money to build up an oil fund and then to invest the returns from that oil fund as Norway have done? Wouldn't that make more sense?
I think that actually investing the returns from oil across the United Kingdom is a good thing. It comes back to the point that issues don't just matter to me in Scotland. It's not about throwing up a border and saying this is where child poverty is an issue. It's a fact that there is child poverty in all sorts of cities across the United Kingdom, and we should use whatever resources we have to tackle them there, which is where the argument about are we subsidised slightly, are we not, by a slight margin, because people don't think that there's huge amounts. It's because we've got a progressive tax system that redistributes tax to where it's needed. So for me, it's not vital that we get a little bit more money out of the UK than we put in.
OK, let's move on to a different subject. Europe. Bill McBratney notes that Norway is not a member of the European Union. Colin from Lossiemouth asks, will Scotland be totally independent or just a small, insignificant country of the EU? Ross?
I don't think there's nothing small and insignificant about countries like Denmark, which, as I said, far more progressive, far happier, less child poverty, etc. My position, and I think the position that the Yes campaigns try to make very clear, is that there isn't actually a mechanism for removing Scotland from the European Union. We think that we will be able to renegotiate our settlement within the European Union. After that, as I said, 2016 we elect the first Scottish Government of an independent Scotland. It's up to whoever we elect then to decide Scotland's continued future within the European Union. What's clear at the moment is the rest of the UK is pulling in a very different direction to Scotland. Opinion polls have shown if there was a referendum tomorrow, a majority of people in Scotland would vote yes to stay within the European Union, a majority of people in the rest of the UK would vote no to leave, and Scotland would have to leave the European Union despite not wanting to. That's where there's a clear democratic deficit.
Chris Cromer asks you, Ross, why are the Yes Scotland campaign so pro-European?
We're not pro-European because we don't take a position on whether Scotland should or should not be in the European Union. Our position is quite simply, the fact is, on day one, we would, just like we are now, but that's the point of independence, that choice. With independence, we can have the choice whether to stay in or leave, but there's no mechanism to automatically remove us.
However, Ross, if the Yes campaign and yourself and the SNP are so confident that we would be in that position where we can just stay in as we are, then surely that's because their legal advice should say that. And if they would release that to us, then the people of Scotland would have that guarantee. But they probably haven't released that.
Who's going to kick Scotland out of the EU?
Well, it's not so much kicking us out of the EU, it's renegotiating the settlement we have. Currently, Britain is exempt from the Schengen Agreement, exempt from the Euro, and has its rebate. And most of the experts who've spoken on this, UK legal advice and the President of the Commission have all said that actually it's unlikely Scotland would have that, and there are serious advantages to the United Kingdom.
Michael, a question for yourself. With the Tory party planning an in-out referendum on EU membership, Keir Liddell asks, is a yes or a no vote on independence the best way to secure Scotland's position in the EU?
Well, personally, I'm opposed to leaving the EU, and I'm a Labour Party member, and we're only going to have that referendum.
But there might be a referendum.
There might be, but I'm going to be campaigning for a different government from the one that would like to set that referendum. But
he's not offering a referendum on the EU. The only people who are offering a referendum on the EU are the Conservatives, part of the Better Together campaign.
And I'll be campaigning against them and hoping that Labour are in government instead of the Tories next time. But even if that referendum came, yeah. I'd campaign positively to stay in the EU, because I think those huge trade benefits that we get from that are massive for the United Kingdom. But it's totally illogical of the nationalists and their campaign to argue about how it's a bad thing that the UK might leave the EU and Scotland being independent is the best way to secure our place in the EU that has so many trade agreements, when they're trying to leave a current union that gives us even more trade. We sell 4 times as much to the rest of the UK as the rest of the world, and they're trying to leave a union that has much of the same benefit.
But doesn't that in-out EU referendum breed uncertainty?
Well, if an in-out referendum breeds uncertainty, then I'm sure the independence referendum must be one of the most prominent cases of that. But I think actually it's what we're being presented with here is a choice between a United Kingdom where we get a choice to try and argue our case for which way we should go, and a Scotland where we hope that we'd still be able to stay in, but we're leaving it in the hands of those people negotiating it. I'll personally campaign to stay in the EU because I think that there's huge benefits to that for the same reasons that I'm campaigning to stay in the UK.
Ross?
I think it's very simple. The only way that Scotland will get a choice on its relationship with Europe is through independence. At the moment, Scotland seems very comfortable remaining within the United Kingdom, not the United Kingdom, sorry, remaining within the European Union. And it's quite simple. The UK as a whole is pulling in another direction. If there's a referendum, and it looks increasingly likely that there will be a referendum on the European Union, Scotland could vote one way, the rest of the UK could vote another, and we get dragged in that direction because, quite simply, the structure of the UK doesn't represent Scotland and Scotland's interests.
Mike Williamson asks, how do you think the rise of UKIP will affect the independence referendum? Of course, it did quite well in the English county elections recently, and Nigel Farage has been here in Scotland in the last couple of days getting a lot of attention. Some of it he'd prefer not to have, especially from protesters in Edinburgh. But what role do you think UKIP might play in the independence referendum?
I think UKIP are an irrelevance in Scotland. I think we both reject the UKIP's political philosophy. It's not welcome in Scotland, but they have
Which bit of it isn't welcome?
I think their anti-immigration rhetoric isn't welcome in Scotland.
Are they anti-immigrant, or do they just want to limit the number of immigrants coming into the UK?
Well, it's a huge amount of scaremongering. They talk about 29 million Bulgarians and Romanians. That's the entire population of 2 countries. They're not going to come here. But going back to the point, on the same day that UKIP gained over 100 councillors, almost 150 councillors in England, there was a by-election in Scotland in the Borders, and they got 3%. They have never got, I think, above 1% in the Scottish Parliament election. They're just not relevant.
Why aren't they members of the Better Together campaign?
Well, I think that's quite essential to notice that they aren't members of the Better Together campaign, because they're not a major party in Scotland.
They're not better together with UKIP.
Well, I don't think that UKIP have a right, so to say, to just decide they're part of the campaign because we agree with them, because they're not one of the major pro-UK parties in Scotland. And I think that it's important to note that the UKIP case that Nigel Farage has been trying to make isn't the Better Together case, and it's not about our independence from the EU as he tries to claim. I think that the EU is a strength, and I oppose Nigel Farage's politics, but I still want to stay in the UK. And Ross says that his politics aren't welcome in Scotland. Actually, his politics aren't welcome in the north of England. They aren't welcome in places in Wales. They aren't welcome across the United Kingdom from a lot of people.
He has MEPs
and they also came second in the South Shields by-election. I want to finish up this discussion, if I can do, by asking you to be as open-minded as you can do. Ross, what would persuade you to vote no?
I would be persuaded to vote no if we could absolutely come up with credible reasons at how we could create a much fairer, more prosperous United Kingdom for young people. I just can't see that.
Michael, what would persuade you to vote yes?
If I thought that an independent Scotland would be the best thing for Scottish people, secure their future, make them better off and have a fairer country, I'd be out campaigning for it now. But I don't think it holds all the answers. I think that we have the strength and the best of both worlds in the United Kingdom, and I want to hold on to those things.
Michael and Ross, thank you both very much indeed. I'm sure everybody will be very well impressed with their level of engagement. Of course, a long way to go in this independence referendum. Good luck with your hires, Michael, and good luck with your job as well and your studies when you go back to them. Ross, well, for more on the independence debate, including lots of background analysis and the latest developments on the story, please go to BBC Scotland News website and click on Scotland's Future. But from all of us here for the moment, thank you very much for joining us and goodbye.